Hi, my name is Ryan Madsen, and I'm going to be working with you on the biology course here at Virtual Academy. And I just want to take you through a quick overview of where we're planning to go with this course. First of all, biology is a fun course. I remember when I took it first in high school, and one of the things I enjoyed about biology was it was kind of the first time where you could really see the connection between science and what you really cared about. And I know I was involved in things like running and soccer, and when we got into biology and we learned about how energy is produced and how oxygen is connected with that process, it was something that was really relevant and really, kind of connected things for me. And it was kind of like, rather than this being theoretical, I could see the direct application in my own life. And that's kind of an exciting part of biology. So it's a fun part of it when you ask that question, well, what does this have to do with me? Well, fortunately, we're all living. And so when we get to biology, we're really exploring living things. So whether it's ourselves or our environment or the animals that we interact with, all of these things have that biology connection. And so it'll be fun to explore what it is that makes these organisms alive and what it is that's required for them to survive and why those things are important. And especially, I think one of the fun parts is when we look at how we can help living things and how we can resolve potential illnesses they might have or other issues they might have by an understanding of biology. And for those of you looking at potentially going into medical fields or veterinary medicine or many fields that are related to that, all of those questions are going to be explored in biology, and you're going to learn more about it and kind of have that preparation in that direction. So just to give you an idea of where we start with biology, one of the things that we start with is we start with cells. And I know when we see a cell initially, we think, okay, well, who really cares? Those are just small. What's that going to have to do, with things that I care about? The one thing we learn in biology, now initially we're just going to be kind of naming parts of the cell, and it will just seem like we're just naming different shapes. But more important than the names are only there so that we can communicate with each other. Far more important than that is how these different parts of the cell interact with each other and why they interact that way. Because one part of the cell is going to be involved in building different structures, building proteins, okay? And then another part is going to be involved in allowing things to enter and allowing things to exit. Another part is going to be involved in producing energy. And when we understand how these parts of the cells interact, then we start to see that in biology, very small things make a very big difference. And really, when it comes to many of the things that matter a lot to us, health is one of those things, but also how our brains work and how our reactions work. All of these things get down to cells. And so by understanding cells, we're able to understand a lot of things that matter a lot. And we'll talk more about that as we go along. Then after we talk about cells, we'll get into this discussion about energy. And energy is one of those concepts that even for scientists, sometimes it's a little bit hard to really define. But we all know when energy is being expended. And one of the most obvious times is like the young lady here running on the screen, is when we do exercise or when we do activity that involves energy. So the fun thing about this is we'll explore where energy comes from, where that energy comes from that we use, for example, when we're running. And it becomes, we've heard this, I know, before, but we'll actually get into how it actually works. We talk about how that energy is generated on the sun. And on the sun, it's essentially a nuclear power plant that's happening. And that energy is transferred to the earth, and eventually it's become something that we can use in our exercise. And so how that process works is a pretty interesting process. And by understanding that process, we also understand what causes it to not work. And that can obviously cause some big problems because everything we do in life involves energy. And if we don't have that energy, we aren't going to have life. And so that becomes a really important, it's called the metabolic process. And I think that as we get into that, it becomes a really fun thing to explore, especially if you're into exercise and sports. After that, we're going to get into something where maybe if you talk to possibly your grandparents, and if they took biology in high school, they might mention, we hardly even talked about DNA when we were in high school. So the picture on the screen is, it's probably an artist's depiction of DNA. I don't think it's an actual photo, but DNA at one point just seemed to be just kind of a side story. Okay, they weren't really sure exactly what DNA did. It seemed to be involved in some way, but it wasn't really clear if it was important or not important. Now it's really become the main actor, the main story of this process of building a new organism and passing on information. DNA is really the blueprint. And by blueprint, I'm talking about when you're building a building, you've got these drawings that say exactly how it should be built. DNA, it's almost like a book that tells you how an organism should be built. And that book is passed on and revised every generation. And we'll talk about how DNA stores that information, and not only that, what could possibly go wrong with that process. And then the really exciting part, especially for those of you who are looking at future careers, will be when we talk about how DNA can actually be potentially modified to resolve diseases that people have. And that's an exciting step, to know that some diseases that we face today that are genetic based could potentially be resolved in the future through modifications to DNA. Now, that question is also a little bit of a scary question, because while we all, I think, pretty much all of us agree that resolving diseases, even if it involves changing DNA, is a great thing to do. But then when it gets to that question of, what if somebody says, hey, I'd like to be taller, or I'd like to be stronger, or I'd like to have a bigger brain or something like that, then is it okay to say, well, we'll do a modification of the DNA to get those results? Because it doesn't take too long to get into these scenarios that you often see in these superhero movies, where you get these, mutants, as they describe it. Obviously, that's fictional, and those types of scenarios aren't very likely. But on the other hand, that's kind of when we stretch our imagination a little bit farther, and then we say, okay, is this the right road to go down? And that's why it's so important in biology to remember that that ethics are critical. And so it's wonderful, as we're here at Virtual Academy, it's wonderful to know that many of you bring, a strong ethical background. And so people with strong ethical backgrounds really should take an interest in biology, and because these types of decisions about how we use this power of DNA are going to be important to the future. And we don't want to put our heads in the sand and say, oh, science is for somebody else, because then we're turning over that decision making to people who may not have that ethical compass that's going to help to become leaders in this area in the future, and how we use this power and this technology. After talking about DNA, we get into an area that's actually quite exciting, and that is how what we learn from DNA about the connections between organisms, and how organisms have this relationship. And it's actually a very exciting area to see the unity of life, and to see that not organisms aren't just existing in isolation, but they have these connections that go back for millions of years. And it's a very fun process to learn how those connections have occurred, and learn about the remarkable changes that have happened over the history of life. And that's a fun area to explore. It's also one of those areas that I think sometimes we come in with a lot of preconceptions, but I hope that people will come in with an open mind on this, and be able to kind of look at it like a scientist does, and say, hey, here's what's in front of me. What's the best way to explain what I see here? And it's fun when you start to do that, to see what is uncovered, and the surprises that can sometimes happen in that process. After we talk about those connections between life, we'll be talking about the nervous system and some other systems of the body. And the nervous system is our brains and our nerves. And what's really interesting about this process, I know when I learned about it first, was that when we think about nerves in the body, we think about them as being completely different than other types of machines that we work with. But I found it really fascinating when I learned that the nervous system is really controlled by electrical impulses. Something just like what you would have in a computer or a phone. A lot of those are controlled in large part by electrical impulses. and our nervous system works with some similarities. Now, obviously, it's not going to be exactly the same. We don't have copper wires running through our bodies, but there is electrical impulses that carry signals from, for example, the end of our finger when a pin pricks it up to our brain. And then it sends a signal back using electrical impulses that tells us, okay, you better move that finger because something's causing pain. And it's really fun to see how remarkable these systems are and how effectively they work, and as well as to see some of the issues that can come up in those systems. And then we'll talk a little bit about the immune system. The immune system is just our way to defend against invasive invasions from bacteria and viruses, and we'll see some of the ways that can work effectively, and how we can improve our immune systems and really understand how that works. Now, when we talk about biology, I mentioned kind of at the start how it's relevant to all of us. Obviously, all of us are living, and so it's nice to know what makes a thing living. But then you might ask, what would this potentially have to do with my future career? So there's the areas we'll be talking about in biology are actually predicted to be some of the areas that are expanding most in the economy. So if you look at like the last 30 years, obviously technology, computers has been one of the biggest areas of expansion. But many economists expect that the areas of genetics and health-related areas will be the area that really expands the most over, say, the next 20 to 30 years. And there are several factors around that. One is with how many new things we're discovering around this area. And it already is a massive part of the economy. So what I mean by that is a lot of the jobs that you'll be exploring will be in health fields. But I'm just going to tell you a few of the areas that you might see more and more jobs. The one that we see right here is what we call bioengineering. And in one of the areas around that could be prosthetics. And prosthetics, in this case, is, for this young lady, it's a robotic arm. And it's really amazing what they can do with these now, where they can actually connect the robotic arm to the nerves. And so the signals that are sent out from the brain can actually cause that arm to squeeze and contract and do many things. Obviously not quite, with the precision of our natural hands, but with some actions that can actually, cause a lot of functionality, and that can actually be controlled by the brain. So this is an area, bioengineering. I have one of my friends is at Stanford doing a master's degree in this, and we actually might have him come and talk to us and learn about some of the things around this area. Obviously, something I've already mentioned, the health fields, all of the health fields are going to involve biology. And it doesn't, I know sometimes we look at health and we say, okay, to become a doctor, it can take 10 to 12 years after high school. And you might be thinking, wow, that's a long time. And it is a long time, but you're doing great things along the way. But it doesn't mean you need to be a doctor. There are actually careers in the medical field that only take 1 year. Okay, like for example, a medical assistant does not take that long. And there are many other careers like phlebotomist, and there's a whole bunch of things. And that demand and need for people who care about others and also have an understanding of science so that they can truly help others is a great demand. And so something to just consider as you're looking at different careers. Obviously, very closely related to that is veterinary medicine. And I know some people that have gone through veterinary medicine. There's a school in Colorado that's one of the top schools. And they'll say that actually becoming a veterinarian is more difficult than becoming a doctor, because you have to know not just the human organism, but you've got to know a whole bunch of other organisms. And so it becomes much more complex. And so a doctor might have something else to say about that. They might say, well, but if you mess up, it's not quite as big a deal as if I mess up. So who knows? But nonetheless, it is a very lengthy process and very fascinating process, especially if you have a love of animals and working with animals. Another area that has a connection to biology, and especially that area when we were talking about the nervous system, is artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is one of the hugely expanding areas. It's as simple as the Alexa speaker you might have at home, or as complex as some of the robots, kind of like it's probably a fake robot here in this picture, but we're looking at a time when robots can, really start to interact, more with humans, and they can produce, they can bring a lot of benefits, especially when used, for positive purposes. But those have a lot of connections. I mean, obviously, the way the robot works, having an understanding of the human mind is important, but also the way, so that it can interact with people. It'll be important to understand the workings of human beings. And then a couple of other areas. Agriculture has been hugely influenced by biology. And only one thing I'll mention there is just the fact that if you would have gone back a few years and known that our population of the world would be somewhere around 8 billion people, people would have said, well, it would be impossible to feed that many people. But because of advances in agriculture through understanding of biology and biological sciences, we're actually able to do a pretty decent job of feeding, the 8 billion people in the world. Not perfect job by any means, but a lot better than many people would have expected had they known, 100 years ago that there'd be this many people on the earth. Some other areas, some of you might be familiar with this. I haven't actually tried this, but the hamburger there in front of you is actually completely plant-based. It is not anything. It is not. There's no beef involved in this at all. And that is an area also where biology is being applied, is trying to find alternative ways to feed people and satisfy their interests without having to use animals. And there's reasons for that. Obviously, some people would look at a health reason, but other people would look at the environmental impact. When you raise an animal, it has a lot more environmental impact than if you can use plants, because an animal has to use about 10 times as many plants as the calories that you get from eating that animal's meat. Or if you can produce the meat directly from the plants, then you're saving a whole bunch of energy. When energy is used, it can be released and potentially release harmful gases. And so that's one of the reasons that this is a really fascinating area. And then one other thing that I'll briefly mention is just these sheep are clones of each other, and some of the technology that allows for cloning and some of the gene editing and gene therapy I mentioned earlier, that's also an area that's greatly expanding and will be an important area for you as leaders as well as scientists to be able to use that technology for good purposes and be leaders that ensure that it's not used for negative purposes. So, and that's kind of where we'll conclude. One of the movies that we'll watch during the semester, it's kind of an older movie now, but it's still very relevant and it's mentioned frequently. In fact, a person who wrote a book just recently about DNA, that's a popular book called Hacking Darwin, but he talked about this. I went to a speech that he gave and he talked about this movie Gattaca. And it really explores some of both the opportunities that are in store in this area of biological sciences, as well as some of the potential risks and what it implies about the decisions that we make and about the aspirations that we have. And so it'll be a really exciting journey to look at some of these discoveries and to explore and consider how they should be used in our society and how they can be used for good. So look forward to taking this journey with you, and please do come in and talk to me about any questions you might have. You're always welcome, and we'll look forward to working with you this semester. Thank you.